Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it, thanks. And also let me know where y'all are watching from and at what time. I'm curious. Darren Blake didn't believe in ghost stories. He grew up rolling his eyes at tales of haunted houses, scoffing at horror movies, and debunking urban legends with smug confidence. Fear, he believed, was a trick of the mind, a chemical reaction misfiring in the dark. So when his friends dared him to spend a night alone in the Black Hollow woods, he didn't hesitate. The dare had been around for decades, whispered among high school seniors and drunk college kids looking to prove themselves. The rules were simple: bring no one, call no one, and last until dawn. That was it. Easy. Still, Black Hollow had a reputation. Some claimed a hermit cursed the land, that his bones lay tangled in the roots, whispering through the wind. Others told of a search party that ventured into the woods in the 1950s and was never seen again. Then there were the campers, those who returned with wild-eyed stares, muttering about waking up outside their tents, their arms scratched by unseen hands. "They say the woods test you," Greg, his oldest friend, had said, grinning over his beer. "The deeper you go, the more it knows you." "The more what knows you?" Darren had scoffed. Greg only shrugged. "That's the point of the dare, man. To find out." Darren had laughed, tossing back his drink. "Fine, I'll do it." And now here he was, stepping into the infamous Black Hollow woods with nothing but a backpack, a flashlight, and his own stubborn disbelief. The trees loomed tall and skeletal, their branches stretching out like fingers, tangled in the gray evening sky. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the highway faded, the wind stilling as though holding its breath. It was just a forest. He repeated it like a mantra, stepping over gnarled roots and fallen leaves, pressing further into the silence. The sun had nearly set by the time he found a clearing, a perfect spot to set up camp. He dropped his gear, stretched his arms, and exhaled. Easy. But as he unrolled his sleeping bag, a strange feeling settled in his chest, a sense of being observed. Darren turned, scanning the trees. Nothing, just shadows stretching long in the dying light. Still, the sensation lingered, prickling the back of his neck like invisible fingers. He shook it off. It was just a forest. He had no reason to be afraid, yet. Darren pushed the unease aside and focused on gathering firewood before the last of the light faded. The air had turned colder, the kind of sharp chill that bit into the lungs. He hadn't noticed it before. As he wandered through the thinning trees, his flashlight picked up something unusual. A massive oak, gnarled and ancient, standing alone in a small clearing. He moved closer, running his fingers along the rough bark. Names, hundreds of them. Carved deep into the wood, some etched with shaky hands, others bold and deliberate. Names upon names, overlapping, some half erased by time. Curiosity tightened his chest. These were the names of people who had attempted the dare before him. But something was wrong. Some of the names were scratched out, jagged gouges where they had once been, the bark peeled back violently, as though someone had tried to erase them from existence, a trick of the light, maybe. The wind, the rain, just decay. Then his stomach dropped. Near the base of the tree, beneath the others, a fresh carving stood out. The lines were crisp, deep, unmistakable. Darren Blake, his own name. A thick bead of sap ran from the last letter, but it was dark, wrong, too dark. It wasn't sap. Darren's throat went dry. He staggered back, scanning the woods, expecting, hoping to hear laughter. One of his friends, hiding in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to jump out and say, "Gotcha!" But the trees were still, the air was empty, and no one else was there. A deep, crawling sensation twisted in his gut. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. Someone could have come out here before him, set this up. It wasn't impossible. Greg or one of the others must have hiked in earlier to spook him. Yeah, that had to be it. The alternative was that something out here had carved his name before he even arrived. And that was ridiculous. Brushing off the sick feeling in his chest, Darren turned and made his way back to camp. It was just a prank. A stupid, elaborate prank. Still, as he walked away, he had the distinct, gnawing feeling that the tree, its nameless, eyeless presence, was watching him go. By the time Darren returned to camp, the sky had darkened into a deep, starless black. The fire he had built earlier crackled weakly, the flames clawing at the night but barely keeping it at bay. He dropped the firewood next to his tent and rubbed his arms, trying to shake off the lingering chill. The unease from the tree still clung to him, but he forced himself to focus on something else. Food. After heating a can of soup over the fire, he ate in silence, listening to the wind weave through the trees. It almost sounded like a voice, low and distant, calling from somewhere deep within the forest. But that was just his imagination, just the wind. Still, the firelight didn't stretch far enough, and the shadows pressed in close. The small clearing suddenly felt too exposed, like something could be standing just beyond the trees, watching. Darren huffed and stood up, grabbing his flashlight. He needed to walk to clear his head. A few steps into the woods, his boot hit something soft. He stopped, aimed his flashlight down, an old rotting backpack. Darren's pulse quickened. It was half buried under fallen leaves, the fabric decayed, eaten through in places. He crouched, hesitating only a moment before reaching for the zipper. The metal was ice cold beneath his fingers. He pulled it open. Inside, the smell of damp rot and old leather wafted up, along with its contents. A battered flashlight, its plastic casing cracked. A wallet, stiff with age, and something folded at the bottom. A note. Darren swallowed and picked up the wallet first. The leather crumbled slightly under his touch, but the ID inside was still legible. Ethan Porter, date of birth, 1978. Darren's mind raced. That meant the guy had been in his late teens when he came out here, and never came back. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the note, the paper dry and fragile. The words scrawled in thick black ink made his stomach turn. It watches from the trees. Don't let it know you're afraid. A cold weight settled deep in Darren's chest. He turned the flashlight over in his hands, pressed the button. Dead. A flashlight. A wallet. A warning. A life left behind. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stand. It didn't mean anything. Maybe the guy had wandered off, gotten lost. Maybe the note was part of some stupid joke. Still, when he got back to camp, he pulled out his phone and searched the name. Ethan Porter, missing person, 1996. Never found. The wind whispered again, curling through the trees. And for the first time since arriving, Darren started to feel afraid. Darren couldn't stop looking at the search results. The articles were old, scanned newspaper clippings barely holding together in the digital archive. 17-year-old Ethan Porter missing after camping dare. Search party finds no trace. Parents beg for answers. It was like staring at a ghost. Darren turned his phone off, rubbing his face. He needed to calm down. This was all just a long-standing urban legend, right? People disappeared all the time in the woods. Bad luck, bad weather, bad decisions. It wasn't supernatural. He just needed to distract himself. Slipping his phone into his pocket, he stood, stretched, and decided to take a short walk before turning in. Just a quick loop, clear his head. The woods swallowed him immediately. The trees were packed tightly here, the air heavy with damp earth and something else, something thick and cloying, like the scent of rotting leaves. Then he saw them. At first they were just silhouettes between the trees. People walking. No, not walking, lurching. Darren's stomach tightened. They were far off, maybe a dozen of them, moving in slow, jerky steps. Their arms swung too loosely at their sides, their heads tilting in unnatural angles. He wasn't alone out here. Maybe they were other campers, hikers. But no one sane would be wandering this deep in the woods at night, moving like that. He hesitated, pulse hammering against his ribs. Then against every instinct screaming inside him, he called out, "Hey!" The word barely left his mouth before they stopped, every single one of them. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then slowly they turned toward him. His stomach dropped. They had no faces. Darren stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. Their heads were smooth, featureless, as if someone had stretched skin over a hollow skull. And yet, he felt their attention. A pressure in the air, thick and wrong. Then they moved, not walking now, advancing. Fast. A strangled sound escaped Darren's throat as he spun on his heel and ran. Branches clawed at him as he tore through the trees, his lungs burning, feet slipping over damp earth. He didn't dare look back. He could hear them behind him, twigs snapping, leaves rustling in frantic bursts. His camp. He had to get back to his camp. He nearly collapsed into the clearing, his tent and fire appearing like a lifeline in the dark. He whirled around, expecting them to be right behind him, but the woods were empty. No movement, no sound, just trees shifting in the wind. Darren swallowed hard, his entire body trembling. He was done. He wasn't leaving the camp till morning. No dare was worth this. Still shaking, he zipped himself inside his tent, closed his eyes, and told himself over and over, "It was just the dark playing tricks on you. Just a trick, just a trick." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere just beyond the firelight, something watched. Sleep came in restless fragments, slipping between the cracks of Darren's unease. He wasn't sure how long he had dozed off before something pulled him back to consciousness. An ache in his gut, a quiet pressure against his chest, a feeling, "You're being watched." His eyes snapped open. The tent was pitch black. The fire outside had burned low, casting only faint flickers of light against the fabric. The air was heavy, thick with silence. Darren held his breath, straining to listen. Nothing. No wind, no rustling leaves. The forest had gone dead quiet. Then the tent shifted, just slightly, barely a movement at all, like something was pressing against it. His breath hitched. Every muscle in his body locked as he stared at the nylon wall beside him, heart hammering against his ribs. It was probably nothing, just the wind. Then the pressure increased. Something was pushing from the other side. Darren swallowed, every nerve in his body screaming. Slowly, he reached for his flashlight, fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold metal. He clicked it on, flooding the tent with light. Nothing inside. Just him, his gear, and the thin, fragile fabric separating him from the darkness outside. He let out a slow, shaky breath. "You're panicking over nothing, man. Just calm down." But as he turned, his eyes caught something. A shape. On the tent wall, a handprint, large, distorted, wet, and it was pressed from the inside. Darren's blood turned ice cold. The light shook in his grasp as he stared at the print, droplets of moisture slowly sliding down the fabric. His breath hitched in his throat. No, that wasn't possible. He had been alone in here. He had zipped the tent shut. There was no way something had gotten inside, unless... His pulse pounded in his ears as he forced himself to move. Slowly, his trembling fingers reached out, hovering just over the damp outline. The fabric was cold. Darren jerked his hand back like he had been burned. The flashlight flickered in his grip, the shadows stretching and twisting along the tent walls. He needed to get out of here, now. With shaking hands, he reached for the zipper, heart hammering as he pulled it down. The second the tent opened, he stumbled outside, gasping for air. But the woods were empty. His fire had burned down to embers, the clearing thick with silence. Yet the feeling lingered. Something had been in there with him, and it still wasn't gone. Darren didn't go back inside the tent. Instead, he sat by the dying fire, arms wrapped around his knees, trying to convince himself he wasn't losing his mind. The handprint. It had to have been condensation, right? Maybe his own hand had pressed against the tent fabric in his sleep. No, it had been too big, too wet, and it had been on the inside. The thought coiled in his gut like a sickness, but he refused to acknowledge it fully. You just need to make it to morning. Then you're done. He kept the flashlight gripped tightly, sweeping it over the trees every few minutes just to make sure he was alone. Eventually, exhaustion won. His eyes grew heavy, the world blurred, his grip on the flashlight loosened, his body slumped forward slightly. And then he woke up, standing outside his tent. The cold bit into his skin. His legs ached, his arms hung limp at his sides. His breath came out in uneven gasps, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He had no memory of getting up, no memory of moving at all. A sharp jolt of terror shot through his spine. He turned wildly, scanning the clearing. The fire had burned out completely. The embers were cold. His flashlight, gone. His backpack, gone. His tent stood a few feet away, exactly as he had left it, but his sleeping bag, it was still inside, zipped up, like he had never left it. A slow, creeping horror wrapped around Darren's chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. His footprints were all around him, deep in the damp earth. But there were other footprints, too. Another set, pressed into the dirt right behind his own. His stomach clenched violently. Something had been walking with him, breathing on his neck. His skin prickled. His mind screamed at him to turn, to check behind him. No, don't look. His breathing was ragged now, his body frozen between fight and flight. Then, a shift in the air, not a sound, not a movement, but a feeling. Something was still behind him. Darren's body went rigid. His instincts clawed at his brain, telling him to run, but every muscle in his body had locked in place. He could feel its breath on his skin. Warm, rotten. He squeezed his eyes shut. If he turned, if he looked, he knew he wouldn't be alone anymore. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, finally, the air lightened. The presence lifted. Darren sucked in a deep, shaking breath. He forced himself to move, to stumble forward toward his tent. He wasn't even aware of unzipping it before he practically dived inside, yanking the flap shut behind him. His pulse slammed against his ribs as he pressed his back against the fabric, body trembling violently. He didn't sleep, didn't even try. All he could do was sit there, wide-eyed in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise, and praying that whatever had been behind him wasn't still there. The sun never rose fast enough. Darren sat curled inside his tent, waiting for the first slivers of light to creep through the fabric, signaling his escape. He didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. The fear had rooted itself deep inside him, thick and smothering. But eventually, morning arrived. Pale light spilled over the trees, washing away the thick, inky black of night. The instant he was sure it was real, not some cruel trick of the dark, he scrambled out of the tent. The woods looked different in daylight. Not safer, just hollow. The trees seemed taller, their gnarled limbs twisting into impossible shapes. The sky above was dull and lifeless, as if the world had faded around the edges. But Darren didn't care. He was leaving. He grabbed his pack, stuffing his gear inside as fast as his shaking hands would allow. Every inch of his body screamed at him to move, to run, to get out. Then he saw it, a structure, standing just beyond the trees in a clearing that hadn't been there yesterday. It was a door. Nothing else. No house, no frame, no walls. Just a single rotting wooden door standing alone in the forest. Darren froze, his breath catching in his throat. The wood was blackened with age, its surface peeling in long, brittle strips. The handle was tarnished brass, rust curling like veins across its surface. But it was the gap between the door and the frame that made his skin crawl. The door was slightly open, and something was moving behind it. Fog coiled out from the crack, spilling into the grass like ink dropped into water. The darkness beyond the door was pure, absolute, as though it led into something far deeper than a room, a threshold. The air around it pulsed, like a heartbeat pressed into the fabric of reality. Darren took a slow step back. He had heard about this, the stories, the warnings. People who saw the door didn't come back. Don't go near it. Don't let it open. Don't let what's inside step through. A sharp creak split the air. The door shifted, just slightly. Then a hand emerged from the darkness, gray, thin, too long. The fingers stretched unnaturally, bones pushing beneath the skin, bending at angles that shouldn't exist. The nails were jagged, cracked, claw-like. It reached for him. Darren's body finally obeyed his survival instincts. He bolted. His feet barely touched the earth as he sprinted through the trees, branches slashing at his arms, his lungs burning. He didn't look back, couldn't. Then, a slam, a deep reverberating click. The door had shut. The pressure in the air lifted. Darren stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, his entire body shaking. He turned, expecting to see the clearing again, but it was gone. Nothing but trees. The door had vanished. Darren's stomach twisted. He had stopped something from coming through, but had it ever really been locked to begin with? And how many times had it already been opened? Darren ran. He didn't stop to think, didn't care about his tent, his gear, his pride, nothing. All that mattered was getting out of these woods. The trees blurred past him, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. His muscles ached, but he forced himself to keep moving, pushing through the tangled underbrush. His mind screamed one thing over and over: leave, leave, leave. Then the ground gave way. Darren barely had time to gasp before he plunged downward, crashing into a pit of bones. The impact rattled through his ribs, Sharp edges scraped against his arms, his legs, his back. The air filled with the brittle snap of old, dry things breaking beneath him. He groaned, pain flashing through his body as he struggled to push himself upright. But the second his fingers brushed the ground, he realized what he was touching. Skulls, femurs, ribs, some gnawed clean, others with bits of rotted flesh still clinging to them. A grave. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. The bones shifted beneath him as he scrambled backward, his skin crawling with revulsion. Then his eyes landed on something worse. One of the skulls, half buried in the dirt, had something carved into its forehead. Deep gouges, ragged and precise, forming two words. Didn't make it. Darren's stomach twisted violently. No. He wasn't going to die here. He wasn't going to end up like them. A noise slithered through the trees above. A whisper, not of words but of intent, hungry, amused. It was watching. Darren shot upward, his hands clawing at the pit's edge. His fingers found purchase on a tangle of roots, and he pulled. Every muscle screamed in protest, but adrenaline overpowered the pain. The bones shifted beneath him. Something moved under them, a wet crack. The sound of something rising. Darren hurled himself out of the pit, collapsing onto solid ground. He barely had time to breathe before something brushed against his ankle. He kicked out violently and ran. No more thinking, no more stopping, just run. His car was close. It had to be close. The forest blurred, the trees stretching unnaturally tall as though they had shifted in the night, closing in around him. Then through the thinning woods he saw it. His car. A sharp burst of relief nearly made him choke. He stumbled forward, his hands already reaching for his pocket. His keys. His hand found nothing. Panic exploded in his chest. He checked his other pocket, then his jacket, then the ground. Gone. A slow, crawling dread settled over him. Then the wind shifted, and a voice, soft as breath, curled around his ears. Your turn. Darren's pulse thundered in his skull. Your turn. The voice didn't come from behind him, or ahead, or anywhere he could pinpoint. It was everywhere, tangled in the branches, seeping through the cold morning air. Something was with him, all around him. He spun in place, his breath sharp, frantic. The trees loomed tall and endless, their trunks stretching like prison bars. The forest wasn't letting him go. No, I'm leaving. Darren turned back toward his car, racing for it. The door handle was cool under his fingers, real, but the locks wouldn't budge. He yanked, slammed his fists against the window. His reflection in the glass looked pale, wrong, like something was watching him from inside his own skin. Then, a flicker, a shift in the air, and he was waking up, not in the woods, not by his car, but in his tent. The sunlight was soft, bleeding through the nylon fabric. Birdsong trickled in from outside. The damp scent of earth, fresh and clean, filled his lungs. Morning. Darren bolted upright, his heart slamming against his ribs. Was it a dream? No. He touched his arms, scrapes, dirt, bruises. His boots were still covered in mud, his hands shaking as they gripped the sleeping bag. It had happened, every single thing. But somehow he had made it to morning. He stumbled out of the tent, blinking at the golden light filtering through the trees. His car still sat where he had left it, the keys lying in the dirt right beside him. Like they had been placed there, like something had let him go. Darren grabbed them, sprinting to his car, shoving himself inside. The engine roared to life, the sound so human it nearly made him cry. He didn't look back, didn't stop, didn't breathe properly until he was back on the highway, the haunted woods shrinking in his rearview mirror. The relief was suffocating. He had escaped. But as he drove home, something gnawed at him, an unease he couldn't shake. It wasn't until he walked through his front door, tossing his bag onto the couch, that the final horror revealed itself. His apartment mirror. Darren barely glanced at it as he passed, until something caught his eye. He stopped, turned, and his reflection was still standing in the woods, not moving, not mimicking him, just standing there, watching, smiling.